The autumn of 1894 had settled over London with particular malevolence, wrapping the ancient city in a shroud of fog so dense that even the familiar landmarks seemed to lose their substance and drift like phantoms through the grey twilight. It was on such an afternoon, when the very air seemed to press against our windows at 221B Baker Street with clammy fingers, that Holmes and I found ourselves drawn into one of the most peculiar and ultimately sinister cases that ever challenged my friend's remarkable powers of deduction. Holmes had been in one of his contemplative moods, alternating between periods of intense activity at his chemical apparatus and long stretches of absolute stillness in his armchair, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. The rhythmic scratch of his pen had ceased some hours ago, leaving only the soft patter of rain against the glass and the occasional crackle of our fire to break the afternoon silence. It was precisely at 4 o'clock. I noted the time by the reliable chiming of our mantel clock when Mrs. Hudson's knock interrupted our quiet contemplation. "Mr. Holmes, sir," came her voice through the door. "There's a young lady here who begs to see you most urgently. She appears quite distressed, if I may say so." Holmes emerged from his reverie with that sudden transformation I had witnessed countless times before, his entire bearing shifting from languid indifference to sharp attention. "Show her up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, I believe our afternoon's scholarly pursuits are about to yield to more pressing matters." The woman who entered our sitting room carried herself with the dignity of one born to better circumstances, though her morning dress was fresh, and her pale features bore the unmistakable marks of recent grief. She was perhaps 25 years of age, tall and graceful, with intelligent dark eyes that held a mixture of determination and barely controlled distress. Her black gloves trembled slightly as she clutched a small reticule, and I noticed that despite her composed demeanor, she had the hollow-eyed appearance of one who had not slept properly for several days. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice clear despite its underlying tremor, "I am Miss Eleanor Toland. I have come to you because I fear that what occurred at my uncle's funeral yesterday was not mere coincidence or mechanical failure, but something far more sinister." Holmes rose with fluid grace, his entire attention focused upon our visitor. "Please, Miss Toland, be seated near the fire. This is my colleague, Dr. Watson, who has been invaluable in assisting me with matters of this nature. I observe that you have traveled here directly from the city, that you are recently bereaved, and that you have spent considerable time in the vicinity of Fleet Street within the past 24 hours. Our visitor started visibly at these observations, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and hope. "How could you possibly know such things, Mr. Holmes? I have told you nothing of my circumstances." "Elementary observations, Miss Toland," Holmes replied, settling into his chair with that characteristic steepling of his fingers. "The particular mud upon your boots is distinctive to the area around St. Paul's Cathedral, and the faint scent of printer's ink that clings to your dress suggests prolonged exposure to the establishments of Fleet Street. Your mourning attire is of excellent quality but recently acquired, indicating a death in the family within the past week, and the slight indentation upon your ring finger suggests you have recently removed a family signet ring, likely for engraving or alteration, following an inheritance." Miss Toland drew a deep breath, and I saw some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Your reputation for observation does not exaggerate your abilities, Mr. Holmes. Indeed, my uncle, Sir Evan Toland, passed away 5 days ago, and yesterday we laid him to rest in the family vault at St. Bride's Church in Fleet Street." "Sir Evan Toland, the financier and shipping magnate," Holmes murmured. "A man of considerable wealth and influence. Pray continue, Miss Toland." "The funeral was arranged for 1 o'clock yesterday afternoon," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she began to unburden herself of her tale. "St. Bride's Church has long been the resting place of the Toland family, and its famous clock is renowned throughout London for its precision. The printers and journalists of Fleet Street are said to set their watches by it, so reliable has it been for generations." She paused, pressing her lips together as if gathering courage for what was to come. There were 2 funerals scheduled at Street Brides yesterday, Mr. Holmes. The first, at noon, was for a humble printer named Amos Barrow, a man of modest means who had worked in Bride Lane for 30 years. Our family's service was to follow at 1 o'clock. The church clock, as I mentioned, is famous for its accuracy and has never been known to err. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes bright with interest. Yet I perceive that yesterday it did err, and in a manner that has brought you to my door. Precisely, Mr. Holmes. As Mr. Barrow's funeral procession entered the churchyard at 5 minutes before noon, the great clock in the tower began to chime, not the single stroke that marks the noon hour, but 13 distinct chimes, as if announcing 1 o'clock. The verger, Mr. Pelham, ran out in great agitation, and even the Reverend Dr. Weathered appeared confused by this unprecedented behavior. She drew from her reticule a small handkerchief, which she pressed briefly to her eyes before continuing. The confusion was considerable, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Barrow's widow was heard to say that her husband had always been early to everything, and some of the printers made light of it. But I could see that Mr. Pelham was deeply disturbed. He examined the clock in face, which clearly showed 12 o'clock, and could offer no explanation for the premature chiming. "And when your uncle's funeral commenced at the proper hour?" I inquired, my medical training making me sensitive to the distress our visitor was clearly experiencing. "That, Dr. Watson, is where the matter becomes truly sinister," Miss Tolland replied, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When our procession arrived at precisely 1 o'clock, and my uncle's coffin was carried into the church, the clock remained completely silent. The hands showed 1 o'clock, but there was no chime whatsoever, only the single toll of the passing bell that is rung by hand for the dead." Holmes had grown very still, his keen gaze fixed upon our client's face. "You suspect more than mere mechanical failure, Miss Tolland." "I do, Mr. Holmes, because of what I observed during the service itself." She reached again into her reticule and withdrew a small brass fragment, no larger than a shilling, its edges cut with teeth so fine they were barely visible. "Mr. Pelham found this upon the stairs leading to the clock chamber, along with traces of fresh oil where none should have been, and a drop of red sealing wax upon the window-sill. But the chamber is kept locked, and only Dr. Weathered and the clockmaker, Mr. Jabez Flint of Clerkenwell, possess keys." Holmes accepted the fragment with evident interest, examining it closely without his usual magnifying glass. "A portion of a gear wheel," he murmured. "Brass, recently cut, and showing signs of having been under considerable stress. Most illuminating, Miss Tolland. But there is more, Mr. Holmes, and I fear you will think me fanciful." Our visitor's voice grew even quieter. During the confusion caused by the clock's behavior, I noticed that several elements of the 2 funeral processions had become mixed. One of Mr. Barrow's pallbearers wore upon his sleeve a mourning band bearing the Tolland family crest, a mermaid holding a comb, though our own men wore only plain black crepe. More disturbing still, the wreath that should have adorned my uncle's coffin, white lilies with a card from our family solicitor, was carried instead behind Mr. Barrow's casket into the nave. Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded street below. "Tell me, Miss Tolland, about your uncle's final hours. Was his death sudden?" Dr. Fallow, our family physician, said that Uncle Evan died of heart failure at 11:30 on Tuesday morning. He was found in his study by our housekeeper, Mrs. Larkin, collapsed beside his desk with his hand pressed to his chest. His pocket watch had stopped at the same time, and Dr. Fallow said there was no sign of struggle or distress beyond what one would expect from such an attack. "And who benefits from your uncle's death?" Miss Tolland's composure faltered slightly. "The will names several charities and business partners, but the bulk of the estate passes to my cousin, Mr. Richard Tolland. He and Uncle Evan had, Disagreements in recent years about the direction of the family business. Where was your cousin at the time of your uncle's death? He claims to have been at the offices in Lombard Street until noon, then at luncheon near the stationer's hall. He mentioned rather callously that the stationer's clock struck the hour loudly above their heads as if to emphasize his alibi. Holmes turned from the window, and I saw that familiar gleam in his eyes that indicated his remarkable mind had begun to perceive the pattern hidden within the apparent chaos. Miss Tolland, you have brought me a most intriguing puzzle. The behavior of Street, bride's clock, the mixed elements of the two funerals, and the physical evidence you have provided all suggest a carefully orchestrated deception. Our visitor leaned forward anxiously. Then you believe my fears are justified? That something sinister occurred? I believe, Miss Tolland, that someone went to considerable trouble to create confusion at those two funerals, and that the famous reliability of Street Bride's clock was deliberately compromised to serve their purpose. The question that remains is whether we are dealing with a case of fraud, theft, or something far more serious. Holmes moved to his coat, which hung upon its customary peg. Watson, we shall take a hansom to Fleet Street immediately. Miss Tolland, I shall require you to accompany us to Street, Bride's Church, where I intend to examine both the clock mechanism and the scene of yesterday's peculiar events. If I am not greatly mistaken, we shall find that the truth behind your uncle's funeral is far more complex than it initially appeared. As we prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded streets of London, I found myself reflecting upon the small brass fragment that lay upon our table. In my years of association with Holmes, I had learned that the most insignificant details often proved to be the keys that unlocked the most baffling mysteries. The case of the clock that rang at the wrong funeral had begun with what appeared to be a simple mechanical failure, but I suspected we were about to uncover a web of deception that would test even Holmes's remarkable powers of deduction. The game, as my friend was fond of saying, was most decidedly afoot. The hansom cab bore us swiftly eastward through the grey, fog-shrouded streets. The familiar landmarks of London reduced to ghostly suggestions in the thick mist. Holmes sat opposite Miss Tolland and myself, his keen grey eyes fixed upon the brass fragment, which he turned repeatedly between his long, sensitive fingers. The rhythmic clatter of wheels upon cobblestones provided a steady counterpoint to his contemplative silence. The precision of this workmanship troubles me, Watson, he murmured suddenly, holding the fragment to what little light penetrated the cab's grimy windows. Note the fineness of the teeth and the quality of the brass. Crude ironwork of a tower clock, but the delicate craftsmanship of a precision instrument, perhaps a pocket watch or chronometer. Miss Tolland leaned forward anxiously. What does that signify, Mr. Holmes? It suggests, Miss Tolland, that whoever tampered with Street Bride's clock possessed both mechanical expertise and access to fine instruments. We are not dealing with a common vandal, but with someone who understood precisely what they wished to accomplish. The ancient church emerged from the fog like a medieval vision, its famous tiered spire disappearing into the grey murk above. As we alighted from the cab, I could hear the steady, reassuring tick of the great clock mechanism echoing across the empty churchyard, a sound that had marked the hours for generations of Fleet Street's inhabitants. Mr. Pelham, the verger, met us at the side entrance. A nervous, precise man, whose obvious pride in the church's famous timepiece had been deeply wounded by yesterday's unprecedented failure. His anxious eyes darted between Holmes and Miss Tolland as he led us into the cold, still interior of the nave. 37 years I've tended this clock, Mr. Holmes, he said, wringing his hands, and never once has it failed to keep perfect time. The mechanism is inspected monthly by Mr. Flint of Clerkenwell, and I oil the visible parts according to his strict instructions. Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries, his attention immediately drawn to the vestry where the mourning bands were kept. Upon examination, One band bore the Toland family crest, a silver mermaid holding a comb, but the stitching at its seam had been crudely cut and resewn. Holmes slipped a finger within the band and extracted 2 short hairs. One, grey and coarse, as if from a beard. The other, glossy brown. This heraldic band did not originate from the Toland household, Holmes observed. It was prepared here, in this very room, that a common printer might wear what belongs by right upon a gentleman's sleeve. Moving to the table, where wreath cards lay scattered, Holmes lifted one bearing a smear of violet ink. The card, originally inscribed for Sir Evan Toland, had been altered with crude strokes to read, Mr. Barrow. Your family solicitor's card, Miss Toland, deliberately changed to ensure the wreaths would be exchanged. Who in this parish uses violet ink of such cheap composition? The printers mostly, sir, Mr. Pelham replied helplessly. It is their common practice. Holmes then examined the key hook in the vestry with minute attention. Watson, observe these fresh scratches upon the brass. Someone has recently taken an impression of this key. And hastily at that, he turned to the verger with sudden intensity. During yesterday's confusion, did you observe anyone entering the vestry who had no apparent business there? There was considerable movement during the disturbance, sir, but now that you mention it, I do recall seeing a tall figure in dark clothing near the vestry door during Mr. Barrow's service, though the morning attire made identification impossible. We must examine the clock chamber itself, Holmes declared, and Mr. Pelham led us up the narrow, spiraling stone stairs. The ascent was long and cold, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The clock chamber revealed the full extent of the sabotage. Holmes moved with practiced efficiency among the great iron wheels and brass mechanisms, his magnifying glass revealing crucial evidence. Around the keyhole, he found traces of beeswax where an impression had been taken. From the strike train, he extracted with tweezers a small wad of blackened cotton that had been placed upon the hammer's tail to muffle its blow. Your silent hour, Miss Toland, he explained, holding up the scorched tuft, a simple but effective method of preventing the 1 o'clock chime. More significantly, Holmes discovered a length of fine, waxed twine beneath the main frame, its end stained with red sealing wax. A cord affixed to the striking mechanism and led down through the church would allow someone standing among the mourners to manipulate the clock's behavior without ever entering this chamber during the services themselves. At the chamber window, Holmes found scuff marks where a rope had abraded the stone sill, along with traces of brick dust that did not match the tower's ancient mortar. A nimble fellow with a climbing rope could reach this window from the alley below, Holmes concluded. The mechanism was prepared beforehand, then activated remotely during the ceremonies. Miss Toland stood very still, her gloved hands pressed tightly together. Then someone planned this elaborate deception deliberately. The question that remains is whether we are investigating mere fraud or something far more sinister. The mixing of the funeral elements suggests our perpetrator required specific items to be exchanged between the 2 services. As we prepared to descend, Holmes paused, his grey eyes bright with that familiar gleam of understanding. Watson, I believe we must pay a visit to the widow Barrow, and then to Mr. Jabez Flint in Clerkenwell. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to orchestrate this confusion, and I suspect the true purpose lies not in the tampering itself, but in what that tampering allowed them to accomplish. The descent from St. Bride's clock chamber found us once again in the fog-shrouded streets of Fleet Street, where Holmes's purposeful stride carried us swiftly toward our next destination. The brass fragment remained clutched in his long fingers, a tangible reminder of the mechanical deception we had uncovered, yet I sensed that my friend's remarkable mind was already racing ahead to connections not yet apparent to Watson or our distressed client. We must speak with Mrs. Barrow immediately, Holmes declared as he hailed a passing hansom. The widow's account of yesterday's confusion may reveal details that escaped the notice of the church officials. The cab bore us eastward through increasingly narrow streets until we reached a modest terrace in Bride Lane, where Mrs. Amos Barrow received us in her small but scrupulously clean parlour. She proved to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, her lined face bearing the quiet dignity of one who had endured hardship without complaint. Her work-worn hands smoothed her black dress as she offered us seats near a meagre fire, clearly unaccustomed to receiving genteel visitors. Mrs. Barrow. Holmes began with uncommon gentleness. We understand that yesterday's funeral service was disrupted by unusual circumstances. Might you tell us what you observed during the confusion? Her eyes brightened with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. Indeed, sir, it was most peculiar. Poor Amos always said street. Bride's clock was the most reliable timekeeper in London. But what troubled me most was the wreath placed upon my husband's coffin, beautiful white lilies, far grander than anything we could afford, with a card bearing the name of Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, solicitor. Miss Tolland started visibly at this revelation, her gloved hands gripping her reticule with sudden force. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "Cornelius Blackwood is my uncle's solicitor. He sent the wreath that should have adorned Uncle Evan's coffin." Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest. "Mrs. Barrow, was there anything else unusual about the mourners or the arrangements?" "Well, sir, there was a tall gentleman in expensive mourning clothes who seemed quite agitated throughout the service. He kept consulting his pocket watch and appeared almost relieved when the clock chimed incorrectly." She paused, dabbing her eyes with a worn handkerchief. "But what disturbed me most was learning that someone had visited my husband's body the evening before the funeral. Mr. Cribb's porter told me a gentleman and clergyman came to pay respects, though I had arranged no such visit. Can you describe this gentleman?" The porter remembered him by his black beard and a peculiar scent. "Lavender," he said. The man showed credentials bearing some official crest, which satisfied the undertaker's assistant. Holmes rose abruptly, his decision clearly made. "Mrs. Barrow, you have been most helpful. We must now proceed to Clerkenwell to interview Mr. Jabez Flint." The journey to Clerkenwell took us through streets where the fog seemed to press even closer, muffling the sounds of industry that characterized this district of clockmakers and precision craftsmen. Mr. Flint's workshop occupied the ground floor of a narrow building, its windows displaying an array of timepieces in various states of repair. The proprietor himself proved to be an elderly man, with keen eyes and hands stained by years of working with delicate mechanisms. Holmes wasted no time in presenting the brass fragment. "From your workshop, Mr. Flint?" The clockmaker examined it closely, his weathered face creasing with concentration. "Certainly not from any tower clock, Mr. Holmes. This is precision work pocket watch quality. The tooth pattern is distinctive, but not of my cutting. Who might possess such skill?" "I had a journeyman, until recently, Luke Ferrars. Talented fellow, but I dismissed him at Michaelmas for selling a regulator without permission. Tall man with a black beard, and he always reeked of lavender water to mask the oil on his clothes." Flint's expression darkened. Too clever by half, that one, and overly fond of violet ink for his correspondence. Holmes's grey eyes glittered with understanding. "Your sealing wax, Mr. Flint, where do you obtain it?" "Odd you should ask. I received a batch in error from Tolland and Pike, the shipping concern. Red wax of inferior quality, but serviceable enough." As we emerged into the grey afternoon, Holmes's expression had grown increasingly grave. "Watson, we have our tall gentleman Luke Ferrars, dismissed clockmaker with access to precision tools, violet ink, and lavender scent. More significantly, he had opportunity to obtain Tolland sealing wax, which connects him directly to our client's family business. But what was his purpose in orchestrating such elaborate deception? That, my dear Watson, is what we must now determine. The mixing of funeral elements suggests items were deliberately transferred between the two services. We must return to examine what passed from coffin to coffin beneath the cover of mourning. Our next destination lay in the narrow streets surrounding St. Paul's Cathedral, where Mr. Cribb's establishment occupied a somber storefront marked only by its discreet brass nameplate. The undertaker himself proved to be a rotund gentleman whose pale complexion and soft voice seemed perfectly suited to his melancholy profession. His office, redolent with the scents of polish and camphor, contained the tools of his trade arranged with meticulous precision. Holmes wasted no time with pleasantries, his keen grey eyes immediately focusing upon the man's ledger. "Mr. Cribb, we understand there were unusual visits to your premises on the evening before yesterday's funerals. Pray tell us what you observed." The undertaker's pale hands fluttered nervously as he consulted his records. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, most irregular. A gentleman presented credentials identifying himself as representing a benevolent society, accompanied by a clergyman who wished to offer prayers over Mr. Barrow's remains. The visiting card bore an impressive crest, and the gentleman's manner was entirely proper." "Might we examine this card?" Mr. Cribb produced the pasteboard from his desk drawer, and Holmes studied it with intense concentration. The embossed crest appeared authentic, but he bent the card slightly, testing its composition. "The embossing shows uneven pressure, Watson. And observe the signature written in violet ink of distinctly inferior quality. A clever forgery, but not perfect." Miss Tolland leaned forward anxiously. "What significance does this hold, Mr. Holmes?" "Consider, Miss Tolland, that we have now encountered violet ink at 3 separate locations, the altered wreath card at Street Brides, Luke Ferraz's correspondence mentioned by Mr. Flint, and now this fraudulent visiting card. The pattern suggests our dismissed clockmaker has been quite busy indeed." Holmes turned back to the undertaker with renewed intensity. "Describe this clergyman and his companion, if you please." The clergyman was tall and dignified, with a full black beard. Most distinctive was his scent, lavender water, quite pronounced. His companion remained largely silent, though I noticed he wore fine gloves and seemed particularly interested in the arrangements of both funeral services. Were the coffins opened during this visit? Mr. Cribb's complexion grew even paler. The clergyman requested a moment of private prayer over Mr. Barrow's remains. My assistant, Mullins, supervised, but allowed them brief access to the viewing chamber. Nothing appeared disturbed, though Mullins mentioned the gentleman seemed quite knowledgeable about funeral procedures. Holmes requested to speak with Mullins privately, and the porter, a steady man with honest eyes, provided additional crucial details. The bearded clergyman had inquired specifically about the location of Mr. Barrow's intended grave, asking whether it lay near the church's eastern wall for the morning light. More significantly, Mullins had observed the gentleman examining the brass nameplate on Sir Evan Toland's coffin with what seemed excessive interest. "During yesterday's confusion at the church," Holmes continued, "were the coffins disturbed in any way?" Mr. Cribb admitted reluctantly that the verger's agitation over the clock's behavior had prompted a verification of the funeral arrangements. Mr. Pelham requested that we confirm the nameplates were correctly positioned. In the vestry, we loosened several screws on each coffin lid to ensure proper identification. Who assisted in this verification? There was a helpful gentleman among the mourners, tall, with a dark beard, who offered his assistance. He seemed quite familiar with such procedures and handled the task with appropriate reverence. Holmes examined the screws Mr. Cribb produced from his toolbox, holding them to the light with his magnifying glass. "Watson, observe these minute traces of violet residue in the screw slots." Our helpful mourner wore gloves stained with the same inferior ink we have encountered repeatedly. As we prepared to leave the undertaker's premises, Holmes paused at the threshold. "Mr. Cribb, during the coffin verification, was anything removed from or added to either casket?" "Nothing was removed, Mr. Holmes, but I did notice that Sir Evan's personal effects seemed slightly rearranged. His pocket watch, which had been placed beside his right hand, appeared to have shifted position." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar light of understanding. "Watson, We must examine the graves themselves before darkness falls completely. I suspect we shall find evidence that our mysterious clergyman's interest in Mr. Barrow's final resting place was not motivated by spiritual concerns. The fog had begun to lift as we made our way back to St. Bride's churchyard, where the raw earth of recent burials stood out starkly against the ancient stones. Holmes moved with purposeful precision among the graves, his keen eyes searching for signs of disturbance that would confirm his growing suspicions about the true nature of yesterday's elaborate deception. The ancient churchyard of St. Bride's presented a scene of deceptive tranquility as the afternoon fog continued its gradual retreat, revealing weathered headstones that had marked the passage of centuries alongside the freshly disturbed earth of yesterday's interments. Holmes moved among the graves with the methodical precision that had made him London's foremost consulting detective, his keen grey eyes examining every detail that might reveal the true purpose behind the elaborate funeral deception we had uncovered. The contrast between the two burial sites proved immediately illuminating. Amos Barrow's simple mound lay precisely 15 paces from the eastern wall, positioned with what appeared to be deliberate calculation rather than the random assignment typical of parish burials. The Toland family vault, an imposing structure of blackened granite bearing the carved mermaid crest, stood in a location that commanded a clear view of the entire churchyard while remaining partially concealed by the ancient yew trees that had grown alongside the church for generations. Holmes knelt beside Barrow's grave, his long fingers tracing patterns in the disturbed soil that spoke of activity beyond the funeral itself. Watson, observe the positioning of this burial site. The printer lies in direct line with both the church's vestry window and the family vault, creating a perfect triangle of surveillance and access. His magnifying glass revealed faint impressions in the earth boot prints that showed the distinctive wear pattern of someone who spent considerable time standing on hard surfaces, consistent with a clockmaker's workshop floor. Moving toward the family vault, Holmes produced his pocket knife and worked with practiced skill upon the iron lock. The mechanism yielded with surprising ease, revealing fresh scratches around the keyhole and traces of the same inferior red wax we had encountered repeatedly throughout our investigation. The vault door swung open with a protesting groan, admitting us to the stone chamber where generations of Tollans had found their eternal rest. Sir Evan's coffin occupied the newest position, its brass nameplate gleaming in the dim light that filtered through the narrow window. Holmes examined the casket with intense concentration, his trained eye immediately detecting signs of recent disturbance. The coffin has been moved, Watson, shifted perhaps 6 inches from its original position, and the brass fittings show minute traces of violet ink consistent with our forger's handiwork. With careful reverence, Holmes examined Sir Evan's personal effects, paying particular attention to the gold pocket watch that had allegedly stopped at the moment of death. As he opened the timepiece, his expression grew suddenly grave. Miss Toland, was your uncle left-handed or right-handed in his habits? Most decidedly right-handed, Mr. Holmes. His distinctive penmanship was quite unmistakable, and he always wore his watch chain on the right side of his waistcoat. Holmes closed the watch with a decisive snap, his grey eyes bright with the intensity of discovery. Yet, this chronometer shows wear patterns entirely consistent with left-handed use. The chain attachment is worn on the left side, the winding mechanism bears the distinctive marks of left-handed operation, and the internal mechanism has been recently adjusted by someone familiar with precision instruments. The implications struck our client with visible force. Then you believe Uncle Evan's personal effects were exchanged during the funeral confusion? I believe, Miss Toland, that we have uncovered evidence of a substitution far more sophisticated than mere grave robbing. Someone required access to your uncle's actual timepiece and used the carefully orchestrated confusion to effect the exchange. Holmes moved to examine the vault's narrow window, where rope marks identical to those found in the clock chamber confirmed his growing theory about the conspiracy's scope. As we emerged from the vault, Miss Toland provided crucial information about family dynamics that cast the case in an entirely new light. My cousin Richard has always been ambitious regarding the family shipping business. He and Uncle Evan had many heated arguments about modernization, particularly regarding a proposed venture into steam-powered cargo vessels. Uncle Evan was resistant, preferring the traditional sailing ships that had built the family fortune. Holmes listened with sharp attention as she continued. Richard claimed to be at his office in Lombard Street during Uncle Evan's final hours. Then at luncheon, near the stationer's hall. He even mentioned, rather pointedly, that their clock struck loudly overhead, as if to emphasize his precise whereabouts. An alibi that depends upon a public timepiece, Holmes mused, his tone suggesting deep skepticism. Most convenient for a man whose family fortune derives from shipping schedules that depend upon precise timing. He paused, studying the darkening sky above Fleet Street, where gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life. Miss Tolland, we are not investigating mere theft or simple fraud. The precision of this operation, the mechanical expertise required, the careful timing of every element all suggest a conspiracy that reaches far beyond a dismissed clockmaker seeking revenge. Holmes secured the vault door carefully behind us, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. The exchange of personal effects, the manipulation of funeral arrangements, and the involvement of Luke Ferraz with his access to your family's business materials through the sealing wax, all point toward a crime that may have begun before your uncle's death rather than after it. The fog had lifted sufficiently to reveal the ancient thoroughfare of Fleet Street bustling with its evening commerce, yet Holmes stood in contemplative silence among the graves. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of growing certainty about the true nature of the conspiracy we were unraveling. Watson, I fear we must now confront the possibility that Sir Evan's death was not the natural passing your family physician described, but rather the culmination of a carefully planned scheme. The question that remains is whether we are investigating murder disguised as natural death or something even more complex. A deception that required Sir Evan's cooperation, willing or otherwise, in his own apparent demise. The weight of Holmes's implications settled upon our small party like the thickening fog that had begun to creep once more through the ancient stones of Fleet Street. Miss Tolland stood motionless beside the family vault, her gloved hands pressed tightly together as the full horror of our discoveries began to penetrate her consciousness. The possibility that her uncle's death might have been anything other than natural seemed to drain what little color remained in her pale features. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant rumble of evening traffic. "Are you truly suggesting that Uncle Evan was murdered?" But Dr. Fallow examined him most thoroughly and found no signs of violence or suspicious circumstances. Holmes began walking slowly toward the church entrance, his keen mind clearly working through the accumulated evidence with that methodical precision I had witnessed countless times throughout our association. "Miss Tolland, the question is not whether your uncle was murdered in the conventional sense, but rather why someone required his personal timepiece so desperately that they orchestrated this entire elaborate deception to obtain it without arousing the slightest suspicion." As we reached the ancient porch, Holmes paused beneath the weathered stones, his grey eyes reflecting the flickering gaslight from the thoroughfare beyond. "Consider the sequence we have uncovered: a dismissed clockmaker, with access to your family's business materials, elaborate preparations to ensure confusion during the funeral services, the deliberate exchange of personal effects between two coffins, and most significantly, the substitution of your uncle's pocket watch, with one showing entirely different patterns of use." Holmes hailed a passing hansom with characteristic decisiveness. "We must interview Dr. Fallow immediately. I suspect his examination may have been considerably more cursory than circumstances warranted, particularly if the apparent evidence of natural death seemed so convincing as to require no further investigation." The journey to Harley Street took us through the heart of London's medical district, where Dr. Fallow received us in his comfortable study with the professional courtesy of one accustomed to serving wealthy families. He proved to be a man of perhaps 60 years, his manner suggesting the comfortable confidence of decades spent in practice without encountering circumstances that seriously challenged his diagnostic assumptions. "Dr. Fallow," Holmes began without preamble, "when you examined Sir Evan Toland's body, what precisely convinced you that death resulted from natural heart failure?" The physician's response revealed the crucial weakness in his examination. "The classic presentation, Mr. Holmes," the deceased found with his hand pressed to his chest, his pocket watch stopped at the apparent moment of collapse. No signs of struggle or distress beyond what one would expect from cardiac arrest. "I have encountered such cases many times throughout my career." Holmes leaned forward with sharp intensity. "But did you examine the timepiece itself? Did you handle it? Test its mechanism, or verify its authenticity as belonging to Sir Evan?" Dr. Fallow appeared genuinely puzzled by such questions. "I saw no reason to doubt its authenticity. It was an expensive gold chronometer of the type Sir Evan habitually carried, positioned precisely as one would expect if he had grasped it during his final moments." "In your experience," Holmes pressed, "do patients suffering sudden cardiac arrest typically have sufficient presence of mind to consult their pocket watches during the attack?" The question clearly troubled the physician, whose professional confidence began to waver as he considered the implications. "Well, no, Mr. Holmes. The pain and distress would typically prevent such deliberate action, but the evidence seemed so conclusive." As we departed, Holmes's expression had grown increasingly grave. Our next destination proved to be the chambers of Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, Sir Evan's solicitor, whose lean and precise features matched his reputation for meticulous attention to legal details. His revelation proved crucial to understanding the conspiracy's scope. Sir Evan had contemplated a codicil to his will, Blackwood explained with professional discretion, establishing a foundation for seamen's widows. It would have significantly limited Mr. Richard Toland's expectations regarding the family shipping business. Holmes absorbed this information with evident satisfaction. "And when did you last see Sir Evan alive?" "So, I visited Toland House on the afternoon of his death to discuss this very matter, but found that Dr. Fallow had already been summoned. Mr. Richard was present in the hall, appearing quite affected by the circumstances. The fog had thickened considerably as our hansom carried us back toward Baker Street, but Holmes's mind was clearly racing ahead to connections that would soon illuminate the full extent of the conspiracy we were unraveling. "Watson," he murmured, "we now understand why Sir Evan's actual timepiece was so crucial to the deception. It provided false testimony to the precise time of death, allowing someone to establish a perfect alibi, while the true circumstances remained hidden beneath the appearance of natural causes." The hansom cab bore us swiftly through the fog-shrouded streets toward Baker Street, where Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his long fingers turning the substituted pocket watch over and over as his remarkable mind assembled the fragments of evidence into an increasingly coherent pattern. Miss Toland remained pale and shaken beside me, the full implications of our discoveries settling upon her consciousness like the gathering dusk that pressed against our cab windows. "The timepiece was indeed the key to everything," Holmes murmured suddenly, his grey eyes focusing with that sharp intensity I had learned to recognize as the prelude to his most brilliant deductions. "Consider, Watson, that a gentleman's pocket watch provides not merely the time of death, but irrefutable testimony to his movements and activities in his final hours. If Sir Evan's actual chronometer bore evidence inconsistent with his supposed final moments in his study, then substituting it with another becomes absolutely essential to maintaining the deception." As we turned into Baker Street, Holmes continued his analysis with methodical precision. Luc Ferrars possessed the mechanical expertise to prepare such a substitution and had access to Toland family materials through the misdirected sealing wax. But the coordination required the funeral arrangements, the precise timing of the clock manipulation, the choreography of the entire deception suggests a mind intimately familiar with your family's affairs and business practices. "Miss Toland, Mrs. Hudson met us at our door with news that immediately heightened the urgency of our situation. "Mr. Holmes, sir. There's been a gentleman caller asking after Miss Tolland." A Mr. Richard Tolland, claiming concern about his cousin's whereabouts. He seemed quite agitated when I informed him she was consulting with you on a private matter, and he pressed me most particularly about the nature of your business together. Miss Tolland started visibly, her gloved hands gripping her reticule with sudden force. Richard knew I intended to seek assistance regarding the funeral irregularities, Mr. Holmes, but I told no one of our specific appointment or your address. How could he have known to find me here unless he has been watching my movements? Holmes's lean frame tensed with that alertness that indicated immediate danger. Your cousin's knowledge of your whereabouts suggests surveillance, Miss Tolland. More troubling still, his agitation implies that our investigation has progressed far enough to threaten interests he considers vital to protect. Moving to his chemical apparatus, Holmes began testing the oilskin envelope we had discovered, applying reagents that would reveal any traces of writing that might have been transferred to the material. The coordination between Ferraz and his accomplice required precise communication, he explained as he worked. Messages, instructions, perhaps even payment arrangements, all of which might have left traces we can exploit. As the chemical treatment began to reveal faint impressions on the envelope's surface, Holmes's expression grew increasingly grave. "Watson, observe these partial letters emerging under the reagent's influence. The violet ink we have encountered repeatedly, formed into what appears to be instructions regarding timing and location. This envelope once contained detailed coordination between our conspirators. The implications struck me with considerable force. Then Richard Tolland and Luke Ferrars have been working in concert from the beginning? The evidence suggests a conspiracy that extends far beyond simple grave robbing or fraud," Holmes replied, his voice carrying the weight of growing certainty. "We are dealing with a carefully orchestrated deception that may have begun with Sir Evan's death itself, rather than merely exploiting it afterward." Holmes moved to his desk with characteristic decisiveness, withdrawing writing materials as his mind clearly formulated the next phase of our investigation. We must now force our conspirators into the open before they can eliminate the evidence we have uncovered or, more ominously, remove additional witnesses to their activities. Miss Tolland leaned forward anxiously. "What do you propose, Mr. Holmes?" "We shall set a trap that exploits their own reliance on precise timing and coordination," Holmes replied, his grey eyes glittering with that familiar gleam of strategic thinking. "You will send word to your cousin that you have discovered irregularities in your uncle's funeral arrangements and require immediate consultation regarding the family vault. The meeting will be arranged for tomorrow morning at Street Bride's Church, ostensibly to examine Sir Evan's coffin for signs of tampering." "But surely such a message will only alert Richard to the extent of our knowledge," Miss Tolland protested. Holmes's smile carried a hint of his characteristic confidence in human psychology. "Precisely, Miss Tolland. A guilty man will be compelled to attend such a meeting to assess the threat to his position, while an innocent one would suggest postponing such disturbing matters until proper authorities could be consulted. His response will reveal much about his true involvement, and his presence will provide us with the opportunity to observe his reactions under pressure." As Miss Tolland composed the message under Holmes's careful guidance, I found myself reflecting upon the elaborate nature of the conspiracy we had uncovered. The substitution of timepieces, the manipulation of funeral arrangements, the coordination with a dismissed clockmaker all suggested months of careful planning designed to accomplish some purpose that remained tantalizingly beyond our complete understanding. Holmes dispatched the message through his network of street irregulars, then began preparing his own equipment with that purposeful energy that invariably preceded his most dangerous confrontations. "Tomorrow morning, Watson, we shall learn whether we are dealing with mere inheritance fraud or with something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated crime that required Sir Evan's death to appear entirely natural while serving the murderous ambitions of those who stood to profit from his demise." The fog had thickened outside our windows, muffling the sounds of London's evening commerce, but I could sense that the true storm was yet to come. The clock that had rung at the wrong funeral had set in motion a chain of revelations that would soon bring us face to face with a conspiracy more elaborate and deadly than any we had previously encountered. The morning of our confrontation dawned with deceptive serenity. London's perpetual fog retreating to reveal autumn skies of crystalline clarity, as if the city itself had conspired to provide perfect visibility for the drama about to unfold. Holmes had risen before dawn, his restless energy manifesting in methodical preparations that suggested he anticipated far more than mere conversation at Streetbride's church. By 7 o'clock, he had transformed himself through one of his remarkable disguises into a lean, weathered stonemason, complete with lime-stained sleeves and a leather satchel of authentic tools. "Remember, Watson," he had instructed while adjusting his workman's cap, "our objective is to observe reactions under pressure, not to stage premature accusations. The guilty mind betrays itself most completely when it believes itself unobserved." With that cryptic guidance, he departed for the churchyard's eastern wall, where he would maintain surveillance while appearing to inspect the ancient mortar. Miss Toland arrived at Baker Street precisely at 8 o'clock, her pale features bearing the unmistakable marks of a sleepless night, but her resolve clearly strengthened by the approaching resolution of her uncle's mysterious circumstances. She carried Richard Toland's reply to our carefully crafted message, a brief note that confirmed Holmes's psychological assessment with disturbing accuracy. "He agrees to meet us at 10 o'clock, she reported, her voice steady despite obvious strain. "But observe his phrasing. Mr. Holmes, he writes that he is eager to resolve these unfortunate misunderstandings about our dear uncle's final arrangements." The language suggests someone seeking to control rather than investigate the situation. Inspector Lestrade arrived with characteristic punctuality, accompanied by 2 plainclothes constables whose positions Holmes had predetermined with military precision. The inspector's sharp ferret eyes gleamed with anticipation as he surveyed the ancient churchyard, clearly relishing the prospect of springing Holmes's carefully constructed trap. As the church clock struck 9:30, our vigil was rewarded by the arrival of a hansom cab that deposited 2 figures near the main entrance. Richard Toland emerged first, his handsome features drawn with anxiety despite his attempt to maintain composure. His companion proved to be the tall, bearded man we had expected, Luke Ferrars, the dismissed clockmaker, whose distinctive scent of lavender water reached us even across the churchyard's considerable expanse. Richard approached with practiced concern etched upon his features, though his darting glances between Miss Toland and myself betrayed his underlying agitation. "Eleanor, my dear cousin, this is indeed distressing. I trust there is nothing truly amiss with Uncle Evan's arrangements." "On the contrary, Mr. Toland," I replied, following Holmes's instructions to maintain pressure while he observed from concealment. "We have discovered evidence of deliberate tampering with both the funeral services and the contents of your uncle's coffin. The irregularities, Miss Toland observed, were merely the visible manifestations of a far more complex deception." Richard's jaw tightened imperceptibly, and I caught the swift, almost involuntary glance he directed toward his bearded accomplice. "Tampering? Surely grief has led to unfortunate imaginings. Dr. Fallow's diagnosis was entirely clear, and the funeral arrangements were handled by London's most reputable establishment." At that crucial moment, Holmes's signal appeared, a handkerchief shaken once from behind the eastern yew. Lestrade and his constables moved with practiced efficiency, converging on the churchyard from predetermined positions while I guided our suspects toward the family vault, under pretense of examining the evidence we had discovered. The confrontation that followed exceeded even Holmes's expectations for dramatic revelation. As we rounded the ancient yew trees, we discovered Ferrars kneeling beside Amos Barrow's grave, the turf neatly displaced to reveal a shallow cavity from which he had extracted a narrow tin cylinder bound with red sealing wax. The container bore the unmistakable impression of the Tolland family crest, a mermaid holding a comb, though applied with the crude technique of an unskilled hand. Faraz sprang to his feet with feline agility upon our approach, his hand darting toward his coat pocket, but Lestrade's sharp command froze him momentarily. "Stand fast, my man." In desperation, the clockmaker hurled a small pellet that burst into a choking cloud of cheap pepper and oil. But Holmes, abandoning his stonemason disguise with characteristic decisiveness, intercepted him at the tower stairs. The brief struggle that ensued demonstrated Holmes's remarkable physical capabilities as he twisted Faraz's wrist until the concealed knife clattered harmlessly to the stone flags. "The bracelets, Lestrade, if you please," Holmes requested with admirable composure, considering the violence of the encounter. As the inspector secured the prisoner, Richard Tolland's carefully maintained composure finally cracked under the pressure of witnessing his accomplice's capture. "Careful of the manifests," he cried involuntarily as the sealed cylinder skittered across the flagstones, and in that unguarded instant betrayed far more than he could ever recall. "Thank you, Mr. Tolland," Holmes observed with grim satisfaction. Retrieving the container. "Your concern for these particular documents confirms our suspicions about their significance to your uncle's business affairs." He examined the cylinder closely, noting the quality of the sealing wax and the precision of the family crest's impression. "Shipping manifests, unless I am greatly mistaken, containing information that would have prevented your inheritance had they remained accessible to proper legal scrutiny." Holmes held the cylinder to his ear, shaking it gently to assess its contents. "Documents that required secure concealment during the critical period following your uncle's death, Mr. Tolland. The elaborate funeral deception served not merely to exchange timepieces, but to provide access to this temporary repository without arousing the slightest suspicion from family members or legal authorities. The morning's revelations had transformed our understanding of the conspiracy's true scope and purpose, revealing a crime far more sophisticated than mere inheritance fraud. A carefully orchestrated scheme that had required months of preparation and the coordination of multiple accomplices to execute successfully. The morning air in Street Bride's churchyard carried an almost electric tension as Lestrade secured both prisoners, the ancient stones bearing witness to the exposure of a conspiracy more elaborate than any of us had initially imagined. Holmes, abandoning his stonemason's disguise with characteristic decisiveness, directed our small procession toward the church vestry, where the accumulated evidence could be examined under proper light and away from the curious eyes of Fleet Street's early morning commerce. The sealed cylinder lay upon the vestry table like an accusation rendered in brass and wax, its crude impression of the Tolland family crest, a mermaid holding a comb bearing the telltale irregularities of hasty workmanship. Holmes produced his penknife with methodical precision, but paused before breaking the seal, his keen grey eyes studying the wax itself with that intense concentration I had learned to recognize as the prelude to significant revelation. "Observe, Watson, the quality of this sealing, wax inferior composition, inconsistent with the materials typically employed by established legal firms, yet bearing traces of the distinctive red pigment used exclusively by Tolland and Pike for their overseas correspondence." He glanced meaningfully at Richard Tolland, whose pale features had grown increasingly drawn as our investigation progressed. "Someone with access to your family's business materials, Mr. Tolland, yet lacking the refinement to employ them with proper skill." As Holmes carefully broke the wax seal, Lestrade methodically emptied Faraz's pockets upon the adjacent table, revealing the complete arsenal of deception our dismissed clockmaker had employed. The items formed a damning collection. Fine kid gloves stained with violet ink, a precisely drawn diagram of a clock's striking mechanism, lengths of waxed twine bearing traces of red sealing wax, a crude church key filed from a cheap blank, and most significantly, a small vial labeled in a stationer's neat script as Purple Aniline Quick Dry. The completeness of the toolkit speaks to months of careful planning, Holmes observed, examining each item with cool satisfaction. Every element required for the mechanical deception, the documentary forgery, and the coordination of timing that made this conspiracy possible. Richard hovered at the vestry threshold, his darting glances between the evidence and the exits blocked by Lestrade's constables, betraying his growing desperation. "This is intolerable, Inspector. I came here in good faith at my cousin's request. I have never set eyes on that man until today." Holmes approached Richard with that predatory grace that marked his most dangerous moments, taking the man lightly by the wrist and drawing his sleeve toward the light. The fine linen showed a faint bruise of purple near the hem, and embedded in the seam lay a small fragment of cheap red wax, like a clot of congealed evidence. "Your cuff tells a different story, Mr. Toland. The churchyard proves treacherous ground for those who carry their criminal activities upon their clothing." The documents within the cylinder proved even more damning than Holmes had anticipated. As he unrolled them with careful precision, the papers revealed themselves to be shipping manifests bearing Sir Evan's distinctive penmanship, each one documenting transactions that exposed a systematic pattern of embezzlement spanning several months. Fictitious shipments to non-existent ports, payments diverted to accounts under Richard's personal control, and most crucially, Sir Evan's handwritten notations questioning the legitimacy of these transactions. "Your uncle discovered your fraudulent activities, Mr. Toland," Holmes announced, holding up a manifest dated 3 days before Sir Evan's death. "This document bears his instruction to investigate these discrepancies immediately upon his return from Portsmouth, a journey that would have confirmed his suspicions and led to your immediate exposure." But it was the final document that provided the most devastating evidence. Holmes unfolded a smaller sheet bearing the watermark of Blackwood's legal chambers, its corner initialed in Sir Evan's firm practiced hand. A draft codicil proposing the Seamen's Widows Foundation we discussed, witnessed in blank but bearing a crucial detail, dated Tuesday at 12:15 in the afternoon. The implications struck our assembled group with the force of revelation. Miss Toland gasped, her gloved hand pressed to her throat, while Richard's carefully maintained composure finally cracked under the weight of this temporal contradiction. "You perceive, Watson, why Sir Evan's actual pocket watch had to be replaced with one showing 11:30. A document bearing 12:15 compels the truth to a later hour, destroying completely the alibi that depended upon the stationer's hall clock striking noon over a supposedly innocent luncheon." Ferrars, who had maintained sullen silence since his capture, suddenly found his voice with desperate fury. "I agreed to help with a simple fraud. Nothing more. The gentleman promised me £500 to arrange the funeral confusion and hide those documents. I knew nothing about poison or any plan to harm the old man." The word poison fell upon our gathering like a thunderclap, confirming Holmes's darkest suspicions about the true nature of Sir Evan's death. Richard's face went ashen as he realized his accomplice's inadvertent confession had sealed both their fates beyond any possibility of denial or escape. "Murder?" Miss Toland whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own rapid breathing. "Richard, you cannot mean to suggest that Uncle Evan's death was anything other than natural." Holmes turned to Inspector Lestrade with grim satisfaction, his grey eyes reflecting the morning light that streamed through the vestry's ancient windows. "I believe we now have sufficient evidence to warrant exhumation of Sir Evan's remains for proper toxicological examination. The symptoms, Dr. Fallow attributed to heart failure are entirely consistent with certain botanical poisons that leave minimal trace after several days, but remain detectable through careful chemical analysis." "You have no authority to order such proceedings," Richard protested desperately, though his voice carried the hollow ring of a man who knew his situation had become hopeless. "Actually, Mr. Toland, Miss Eleanor's status as next of kin provides exactly such authority," Holmes replied with quiet finality, "and I believe she will be most eager to learn the truth about her uncle's final hours, regardless of the personal cost to family reputation." Miss Toland stood with quiet dignity despite the horror of the revelations surrounding her, her dark eyes reflecting a strength that would serve her well in the difficult days ahead. "Uncle Evan deserves justice, Mr. Holmes. Whatever the consequences for our family name, I will not allow his murder to remain concealed by my cousin's elaborate deceptions." As Lestrade prepared to transport both prisoners to Scotland Yard, Holmes stood among the ancient stones with that contemplative expression that marked the successful resolution of his most challenging cases. The famous clock of Street Brides continued its steady marking of the hours above us, its honest chimes now restored to their proper function after serving as an unwitting accomplice to murder and fraud. "The irony is complete, Watson," Holmes observed as we prepared to leave the churchyard for what I suspected would be the final time. Richard's obsession with precise timing and mechanical coordination ultimately provided the very evidence needed to expose his crimes. The clock manipulation that was meant to conceal murder instead created the trail of clues that led us inexorably to the truth. The morning fog had lifted completely from Fleet Street, revealing the bustling commerce of London's newspaper district in all its vigorous activity. Yet I knew that the reverberations of this case would echo through the city's financial circles for months to come as the full extent of the Toland conspiracy became public knowledge. The solemn process of exhumation commenced within 48 hours of our dramatic confrontation, conducted under Miss Toland's resolute authorization and Inspector Lestrade's careful supervision in the cold quiet of Street Brides churchyard. The ancient stones bore witness to this grim necessity, as Holmes attended with characteristic gravity, directing the careful collection of tissue samples for analysis, while the famous clock above continued its honest marking of the hours that would soon reveal the full extent of Richard Toland's murderous conspiracy. Dr. Littlejohn of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, whose expertise in toxicological analysis had proven invaluable in several of our previous cases, delivered his findings with the measured precision of one accustomed to presenting evidence in criminal proceedings. The tissue samples revealed unmistakable traces of aconitine, a deadly alkaloid derived from monkshood that produces symptoms virtually indistinguishable from acute cardiac failure when administered in carefully calculated doses. The poison was introduced approximately 2 hours before death. Dr. Littlejohn explained during our consultation at Baker Street, his weathered features grave with professional concern. The concentration suggests someone with considerable knowledge of botanical chemistry, administered most likely dissolved in brandy or similar spirits to mask the bitter taste. Holmes received this confirmation with characteristic satisfaction, though his grey eyes reflected the somber weight of having proven murder rather than mere fraud. "There is your silent assassin, Watson, a botanical counterfeit of natural failure that leaves little mark save a fatal disruption of the heart's rhythm. The timing corresponds precisely with Richard Toland's visit to his uncle's study, ostensibly to discuss the proposed charitable foundation. With the scientific evidence secured, Holmes proceeded to lay out the complete mechanics of the conspiracy with that methodical precision that had made him London's foremost consulting detective. The audacity of the plot was its most remarkable feature, Watson. Richard, facing exposure for systematic embezzlement spanning 18 months, found himself trapped by his uncle's growing suspicions and the impending codicil that would have stripped him of his inheritance. The dismissed clockmaker Luke Ferrars, now cooperative under the weight of evidence, had revealed the elaborate coordination required for their deception. Richard's psychological manipulation had been masterful. Each phase presented as legitimate investigation rather than criminal conspiracy, allowing Ferrars to rationalize his participation while providing the mechanical expertise essential to the scheme's success. "Consider the sequence in its entirety," Holmes continued, settling into his armchair with his pipe. Sir Evan's death needed to appear natural, but the timing was crucial for Richard's alibi. The aconitine, administered during that final visit, would produce initial symptoms resembling indigestion, allowing the murderer to depart before fatal effects manifested. However, Sir Evan's actual pocket watch, if found upon his person, would have recorded the true moment of death, a time that would have contradicted Richard's carefully constructed luncheon alibi at the stationer's hall. The substitution of timepieces required the elaborate funeral deception that had first brought Miss Tolland to our door. Ferrers's expertise with the street bride's clock mechanism created the confusion necessary for multiple exchanges. The forged visiting card gained access to the undertaker's premises. The tampered striking mechanism produced the premature chiming at noon while remaining silent at 1 o'clock. And the carefully orchestrated chaos allowed for the switching of mourning bands, wreaths, and most crucially, the pocket watches themselves. The sealed manifests buried beneath Amos Barrow's grave represented the final element, Holmes explained. These documents, bearing Sir Evan's handwritten questions about fictitious shipments and diverted payments, constituted proof of Richard's embezzlement. They required temporary concealment during the critical probate period, and what better hiding place than a fresh grave that would remain undisturbed for months? Miss Tolland, who had borne these revelations with remarkable fortitude, found herself inheriting substantial wealth, tainted by the criminal methods employed to preserve it. Uncle Evan's foundation for seamen's widows will be established exactly as he intended, she declared with quiet determination. The money Richard attempted to steal will serve the charitable purposes my uncle envisioned, regardless of the scandal surrounding its recovery. Holmes observed her with evident respect, recognizing in her resolve the same moral courage that had brought her to our door when lesser spirits might have accepted the apparent natural explanation for her uncle's death. Your uncle's legacy will be one of justice served and charity fulfilled, Miss Tolland. The criminal conspiracy that sought to pervert his intentions has instead ensured their complete realization. The subsequent legal proceedings at the Old Bailey attracted considerable public attention due to the elaborate nature of the deception and the prominence of the Tolland family in London's commercial circles. Richard's defense attempted to minimize his culpability by emphasizing Ferrers's mechanical contributions, but the documentary evidence of premeditation, the toxicological proof of deliberate poisoning, and the systematic pattern of embezzlement left little room for judicial sympathy. Ferrers, confronted with the physical evidence, the diagrams, the ink-stained gloves, the forged credentials, the mechanical fragments, abandoned his initial protestations and provided detailed testimony about the conspiracy's coordination. Richard Tolland, arraigned for murder and fraud, maintained a cold silence that not even the recitation of his embezzled accounts could penetrate. As autumn deepened into winter and London's familiar fog returned to shroud the ancient streets, Holmes reflected upon the case with that philosophical detachment that marked his most profound observations. You see, Watson, it is not the clock that convicts, but the mind that misuses it. Time is an honest witness, it is men who coax it to perjure itself. The famous clock of street brides, restored to its proper function after serving as an unwitting accomplice to murder, continued its reliable marking of the hours above Fleet Street's bustling commerce. Yet for those of us who had witnessed its manipulation in service of criminal deception, its steady chimes would forever carry the memory of how mechanical precision had been perverted to conceal the most fundamental crime against human nature. I found myself reflecting, as I laid down my pen to record this singular case, upon the remarkable powers of my friend, who had drawn from the smallest fragment of brass, the faintest smear of violet ink, and the subtlest silence of a famous bell, the irrefutable proof that murder had worn the face of mourning, and fraud had borrowed the solemn vestments of death. The case of the clock that rang at the wrong funeral had demonstrated once again that no criminal scheme, however elaborate or carefully planned, could ultimately withstand the methodical application of logical deduction combined with careful observation of physical evidence. The conclusion of the trial at the Old Bailey brought swift and decisive justice to the perpetrators of this elaborate conspiracy. Richard Tolland received the death sentence for the premeditated murder of his uncle, while Luke Ferrers, whose cooperation had proven essential in establishing the full scope of their criminal enterprise, was sentenced to 20 years penal servitude. The judge's final remarks emphasized the calculated nature of their deception, noting that the mechanical precision employed in the clock manipulation demonstrated a level of premeditation that precluded any consideration of mercy or mitigation. As winter settled over London with its familiar embrace of fog and flickering gaslight, Miss Eleanor Toland paid us one final visit at Baker Street. The establishment of her uncle's charitable foundation had proceeded exactly as Sir Evan had envisioned, with the recovered embezzled funds providing substantial endowment for the seamen's widows, whose welfare had occupied his final thoughts. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her mourning attire now bearing the composure of one who had seen justice served, rather than the desperate uncertainty that had first brought her to our door. "Mr. Holmes," she said, settling near our fire with graceful resolve, "I confess there remain certain mechanical details of this conspiracy that continue to perplex me. How precisely did Ferrars manipulate Street Bride's famous clock to chime 13 at noon, yet remain silent at 1 o'clock? Holmes rose with characteristic fluidity, moving to examine the substituted pocket watch that still occupied a place of honor upon our mantelpiece. The silence at 1 o'clock was achieved through a simple expedient. Miss Toland a wad of cotton placed upon the hammer's tail, which deadened the blow while leaving the mechanism otherwise undisturbed. The extra chime at noon required more sophisticated intervention. He paused, his keen grey eyes reflecting the firelight as his mind worked through the technical details once more. Ferrars employed a fine waxed cord, led from the clock chamber window down to the churchyard, where it could be manipulated from among the mourners. A single tug released the striking train's detent one tooth beyond its proper position, causing the bell to sound 13 times instead of 12. And the brass fragment that began our investigation? A piece of precision clockwork from a pocket chronometer, deliberately broken to create the makeshift spring mechanism required for his deception. The quality of the workmanship immediately suggested someone with access to fine instruments rather than the crude ironwork of a tower clock. As Miss Toland prepared to depart, she paused at our threshold with evident gratitude. "You have not merely solved a puzzle, Mr. Holmes, but restored my uncle's honor and ensured his true legacy will endure. The foundation will stand as testimony to his charitable intentions, unmarred by the criminal conspiracy that sought to pervert them." After our visitor had disappeared into the fog-shrouded evening, Holmes settled into contemplative silence, his violin lying untouched as he gazed into the flickering coals, the familiar sounds of Baker Street, the steady clip-clop of hooves upon cobblestones, the distant cry of vendors, the reassuring tick of our mantel clock provided comfortable counterpoint to our quiet reflection. "You know, Watson," Holmes murmured eventually, his voice carrying that philosophical note that marked his deepest insights into criminal behavior, "this case has demonstrated a fundamental truth about elaborate deceptions. The more intricate the machinery of fraud, the more numerous the points at which it may fail." Richard Toland's obsession with mechanical precision and documentary forgery created exactly the trail of evidence required to expose his crimes. I found myself reflecting upon the remarkable chain of deduction that had begun with seemingly random funeral irregularities and culminated in the exposure of premeditated murder concealed beneath natural appearances. The case of the clock that rang at the wrong funeral would take its place among those investigations that best illustrated Holmes's extraordinary ability to perceive criminal design within apparently innocent circumstances. As I prepared to close my account of this singular mystery, the great clock of Street Bride struck the hour across the rooftops of Fleet Street, its honest chimes now restored to their proper function after serving as unwitting accomplice to murder and fraud. The sound carried through our windows with the reliability that had made it London's most trusted timekeeper. Yet, for those of us who had witnessed its manipulation in service of criminal conspiracy, each chime would forever echo with the memory of how mechanical precision had been perverted to serve the darkest purposes of human ambition. Holmes had once again proven that no criminal scheme, however elaborate or carefully coordinated, could ultimately withstand the methodical application of logical deduction combined with careful observation of physical evidence. The clock that had rung at the wrong funeral had ultimately tolled the hour of justice for those who sought to make it accomplice to their murderous designs.